I'm Ben Clarke from the University of Oregon, Maria Longhi from the University of Texas, Chris Dover from the University of Texas, and Lina Shanley from the University of Oregon. This is a group that's worked together on a number of projects. So we're each talking about a different project today, but I'll know a little bit about Chris's work, he'll know a little bit about mine, and so forth. So we've worked together for the core group for 5 to 10 years now. So it's been very productive. I can start screen sharing if that makes sense now. Okay. And I'm going to do slideshow. Oh. Is that working for everybody? Do they see red or do they see slides?
Looks like slides.
Okay, good. So we'll go ahead and get started. We have about 5 minutes, just a quick introduction, and about 10 minutes for each of the presentations, and then time for questions. And I think people are going to put them in chat maybe, or we can just address them at the end with raised hands, or however we're doing it these days. So the main goal of today is to talk about some development work that we've done across math and science to essentially design interventions for kids that are struggling in those content areas, and a process by which our team does that, utilizing a curriculum research framework to guide our work in that area. So I'll skip over the background just really quickly. We know that there's significant need in both math and science. Kids have long-term issues that arise early. So similar to the push for early reading, there's now a push for work in the areas of early math and early numeracy to try to address those longitudinal trajectories. There's not a lot of work that's been done in those areas, at least compared to reading, but there's starting to be a pretty good research base. And in large part, this is to try to link across what we would say are two domains that are oftentimes treated separately, but really should be treated together. And that's the idea of linking scientific research, which is about the creation of knowledge, to curriculum development, which is creation of instructional materials. Oftentimes they're driven by different goals and objectives. And because of that, you have a little bit of a disconnect between the two. And so the curriculum research framework is really an attempt to try to link those two pieces. The curriculum research framework was first proposed by Doug Clements in 2007, an article that he wrote, which he laid out sort of the process that he saw that would benefit curriculum developers if they engaged in this to create materials that were more based in the research and scientifically based. You'll hear all the time things around design science and so forth, and he noted that one of the considerations with design science was that it was just about one aspect of curriculum development. He wanted to really take something from conceptualization all the way through sort of large-scale summative efficacy trials, essentially. And to do that, he came up with 3 basic categories that guided the work, and in each category there were multiple phases. So within the main categories, we're sort of looking at the a priori foundations of the work. Then the next category was learning models, which have only 1 phase. And then the last one was evaluation, which has 5 phases. So for today's presentation, all the presentations will talk a little bit about a priori and learning models, but we really have nested the 4 presentations along this evaluation category and the phases within the evaluation category, from sort of initial testing of usability and feasibility. So Maria and Chris will talk a little bit about that, all the way to large-scale summative evaluation, which is what I'll talk about. And then at the end, we link back to Lina, and she'll talk a little bit about something that we're doing on the very tail end, sort of a phase 10, but we're linking that back to rethinking our conceptual models and so forth. So you can see the phases here. Sorry, my neighbor is cutting his grass at 8. You can see the phases here. So really a priori is getting to know the theory, the foundations upon which you're going to build a theory of change. This is really sort of the why an intervention might potentially work, trying to find maybe the active ingredients that you theorize result in changes for students. The learning models are really about taking that initial theory and building prototypes of learning activities, and it can be small scale to large scale, but prototypes, and then sort of iterating on those prototypes to try to get sort of the lesson activity or the lesson component that you think is going to be the key to student learning. And then the evaluation phase, again, is doing sort of what I would say multiple tests with multiple users across a lot of different contexts to see whether or not the prototypes that you've developed have worked. And across all these, there's a really heavy emphasis on you don't necessarily go in a linear fashion 1 through 10, but you may be advancing, going back as you learn about different things through your scientific process. This is actually taken directly from the Clements 2007 article, and it's really, I think, a nice roadmap for anyone that does curriculum development to think across sort of multiple domains of goals and objectives and research questions that you would ask. So you have practice, policy, and theory domains, and then the questions that you asked are linked to sort of the effect of the curriculum, and then also what most of us are really interested in now, the conditions under which the curriculum may or may not work. So finding out for whom and under what conditions. So each one of us will reference back to this as part of our presentation, but we're going to go ahead and kick it off with our first presentation. So I need to stop screen sharing and move it to. So now I think, do I make someone else the presenter, or Maria, do you just hop off?
I think I can continue.
Okay, great.
Let's see. Do you see my slides now?
Yep.
Yeah, all right. Well, thank you, Ben. And as Ben mentioned, my name is Maria Longhi, and I'm presenting to you from the United States, and I'm a research associate at the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk at the University of Texas at Austin. And I appreciate this opportunity to be with you. So my colleagues and I have spent the last 3 years working to establish the feasibility of a second grade science intervention that we call Scientific Explorers, or SCI-2. And my colleague, Dr. Dobler, who'll be presenting also in this panel, led the efforts for this science intervention work. So we just want to give a quick shout out to our funding agency, the National Science Foundation, and other partners, both at the University of Texas and at the University of Virginia, who have made this work possible. And also I'd like to quickly acknowledge those folks that work behind the scenes, some smart and dedicated folks that worked across this multi-year project. So this presentation focuses on the feasibility and the usability of the SCI-2 intervention, and this is situated in phases 6, 7, and 8 of the curriculum research framework that Dr. Clarke just discussed. And so as he alluded to, data shows that a significant number of US students struggle to become STEM literate, particularly in the areas of mathematics and science. And yet there's a shortage of feasible and effective STEM interventions designed to address the needs and the strengths of all students. Most efficacious interventions are feasible for the end user. So you could argue that this holds true across fields, like, for example, the field of medicine. Therefore, it's critical.
Go on, Milo.
Oh, is that someone's, or maybe someone's talking to their dog. Okay, so it's critical to conduct feasibility studies of educational interventions with the potential users. And by doing this, we see firsthand what the teachers and the students' experiences look like, as well as receive valuable feedback on what they think about the intervention. So there's a national push here in the United States to promote STEM literacy for all learners. So we were funded and tasked by the National Science Foundation to iteratively design and rigorously test a second grade whole class science program to increase the science achievement among all learners. And so in the next few slides, I'll go through what the finished SCI-2 intervention consists of, and then I'll discuss later what we learned from those feasibility studies to get to this finished product. So the Site 2 intervention consists of 10 lessons, and it's grounded in the principles of guided inquiry instruction. These lessons are delivered in a whole class setting and include both hands-on and simulation activities. The main focus of the lessons are systems. So essentially we're teaching students how the forces of wind and water change the shape of the land and how these changes can happen quickly and slowly, and then designing solutions to slow down or prevent these changes from taking place. And so given the current changes in our on our planet, I would probably, most of you would agree that this topic is of utmost importance for our students. So in addition, we've embedded early literacy and mathematics skills within these lessons, hence why we're here at this conference. So when we designed Site 2, we structured the lessons around 5 key components: spark your thinking, vocabulary, read aloud, scientific investigation activities, and share your thinking. So here's an example of our teacher manual. So this is where we have our lessons. Our lessons are scripted. They include the approximate time, the grouping format, and the materials that are used within each section of that framework. Here's an example of our big book that's used during the read aloud section of the framework. And it really provides students the background knowledge and basic information about the science concepts that they'll be investigating. And it also includes our lovable and adorable characters, Rocky and Gina, who take students along this learning journey. So we have 2 posters. The one on the left really supports students' understanding of the scientific practices, and the one on the right guides students to use their data to really support their findings. So here's an example of our lesson cards. We have 2 sets. We have vocabulary cards. So they show the vocabulary word, a student-friendly definition. And then on the back is a very systematic routine that the teachers use to introduce these words to the students. And then we have lesson cards for our scientific investigations. Here's an example of our science journal. It provides students a place to record their observations, their data, and their findings. And we have, in addition to our hands-on investigations, we have this one simulation-based investigation that allows students to virtually conduct scientific investigations in a location that they may otherwise not have access to, like the mountains. So for example, here the students learn how the amount of rain affects erosion on a mountain and how trees can help slow down that erosion. All right, so now I'll share with you the feasibility studies that we engaged in during the design and the development years of this project and what we learned from this iterative process. Across a 3-year period, we conducted feasibility studies in 13 second grade classrooms, both in Texas and Virginia. The studies centered around our print-based lesson activities, our hands-on scientific investigations, and also the simulation-based investigation. So the focus of our testing was on the functionality of both the teacher materials and the student materials. We also focused on the likability of our Site 2 characters like Gina and Rocky that you met earlier, and also on the difficulty of the targeted content. So the content included characteristics of rocks, weathering, erosion, and deposition. So we collected data through direct observations and also teacher and student focus groups. And both researchers and teachers implemented the Site 2 intervention during these studies. So we conducted a total of 8 feasibility studies with approximately 250 students in second grade. And here in the US, that's students for 7 and 8 years of age. And so now in the next slides, I'm going to share with you these findings from these feasibility studies. And the findings come from anecdotal and qualitative data, not necessarily quantitative data, because in this stage of the research, the type of data, this type of data, the anecdotal and the qualitative, really help us see the functionality of the program. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we're seeing how the forces of wind and water can change the shape of the land. And so imagine using water in a classroom with 7 and 8-year-olds. So that could become quite messy, right? All right, so what did we find? So for our print-based lesson activities, we learned from the feasibility studies that the lesson, the components of the lesson framework, as well as the sequence, worked well. Our revisions consisted of reducing the amount of lessons from original 24 to just 10, and also reducing the length of each of the lessons to really fit the science time that they have on their daily schedule. We also needed to reduce the amount of text in our lesson script, and then also reduce the size of our big book. We had quite an enormous big book, and it wasn't feasible for the teacher to hold and display. Although the pictures were large enough for the whole class of students to see, it wasn't feasible for the teacher. So here's some examples of student work. We looked at this work to see, are the students able to record numbers of the text, if they're able to trace in the spaces provided in this journal. And we found that in second grade, writing does take a long time for students. And so we had to make adjustments based on this. For hands-on investigations, we found that the hands-on investigations were engaging for students. They were manageable both for the teacher and the students. But our revisions consisted of just rethinking how we could minimize the potential loss for using water and the amount of prep time and cleanup time for these hands-on materials. And this actually is where the idea of the simulation-based investigation of the mountain erosion actually started. So for the simulation-based investigation, we found that students could interact well with the interface of the app. It was manageable for 2 students to work with 1 device as we had originally intended. But our revisions consisted of adding more teacher-led activities to add demonstrations of how to take the data from this app and transfer it to the data tables in order for students to be able to analyze all the data. So to conclude, after we went through several iterative cycles of feasibility studies and revisions, and we were ready to move down the design to efficacy pipeline, and we moved to phase 9 of the curriculum research framework. And this past winter, we conducted a randomized control trial in 18 classrooms. And our initial findings demonstrate the promise of the SCI2 program for moving that student achievement dial in science. And we submitted our results to a registered report, and currently we're making revisions to our program using the quantitative data that we generated in the pilot study. And so if you have further if you'd like further information, you're more than welcome to email Dr. Dobler or myself. And Dr. Dobler is going to now continue and talk further about this phase 9 of the curriculum research framework. So I'll stop and my screen, I guess. Yeah.
Thanks, Maria.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can everyone see the slides? Good to go. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. My name is Christian Dobler. I'm from the University of Texas. I'm assistant professor in the Meadows Center for Preventing Educational Risk. And I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes or so talking about the promise of a first grade intervention focused on measurement and data analysis. So as Maria indicated, I'll be moving down the design efficacy pipeline. And so quick acknowledgements to our funding agency. This is a National Science Foundation funded project, as well as our colleagues at the Center on Teaching and Learning at the University of Oregon. And because this is a multi-year project, very large scale, there's a host of folks who have made this project quite successful over the years. So to quickly set the scene, give you kind of a 35,000-foot view of the case for the research. One, I think most would agree that measurement and data analysis offer important context for students to apply and strengthen their whole number understanding and operations. And also these topics and these domains are critical for our everyday lives. I'm sure most of you all out there can see everyone's faces, but we have an important political election going on here in the US. So being able to interpret political polls and data are essential for our society. And so despite those affordances, there's very little research that's been conducted in these areas, in particular for students who are with or at risk for mathematics learning disabilities. So kind of against that backdrop, we were funded for a 4-year project. We're actually in our 6th year for this NSF sponsored, it's a design and development DRK 12 project. We're in our 2nd no cost extension, so we're in our 6th year, but we were essentially tasked with 2 things from the NSF. One was to design a feasible 1st grade math intervention focused on measurement and statistical investigation, and then also to demonstrate the initial promise of the intervention for increasing student achievement within the context of a very rigorous pilot study. And so here, just to give you a quick operational definition of what promise means, I'm referring to it as initial efficacy. And so from Maria's presentation to the current one, and then we'll pass it on to Dr. Clarke in a few minutes, is that we're moving down the pipeline. And so this presentation is situated in phase 9 of the curriculum research framework. So we're trying to build some promise and evidence behind the intervention. Give you a quick snapshot of the intervention. This is it's a 1st grade intervention, as I indicated, has 32 lessons. They're designed to be delivered 30 minutes per day, 4 days per week, for approximately 8 weeks, and it's targeting topics, concepts, skills, problem-solving skills from measurement and domain topics in the U.S. Common Core state standards. And I build it as a hybrid platform in that it has conventional kind of print-based activities, but we also have technology-based activities, which I'll share some quick examples of those as well. And we have, it's delivered in small group format, so it's a 5-to-1 student-teacher ratio, and it's designed for students who are 6 to 7 years of age who are with or at risk for math learning disabilities. And so to kind of situate this intervention within a meaningful context, we grounded the lessons within life and earth science topics from the U.S. Next Generation Science Standards, just to give some contextual background, if you will, for the intervention. In terms of the math content, just quickly, we targeted length measurement. So students were learning concepts like unit iteration, conservation, and also data analysis. So applying a framework of statistical investigation, similar to Maria's presentation, we had practices of science. So really teaching students how to act as a scientist and engage in data analysis and early statistical investigation. Now, one innovative feature of, we would argue, for our intervention is this technology-based platform. So again, students are sitting in a small group context or format, and their iPads are connected to the teacher iPad. And so this teacher view aspect or feature allows the teacher iPad to kind of control, if you will, the student iPads and selecting activities and such. And that really helped out with classroom management and things, keeping everybody on task. So just give you a quick view of the different technology-based activities. We had direct vocabulary instruction. We had opportunities for students to interpret and represent data, as well as engage in problem-solving skills. So word problem-solving being a critical skill and concept that students need or expected to learn. So I'll spend the remaining time just briefly talking about some results from a recent pilot study that we conducted with the precision math intervention. And what we were focused on, again, was just establishing this promise of the intervention. So we're looking for, is there initial efficacy? Can we move the student math achievement dial for 1st grade students who are with or at risk for math learning disabilities? And so we pitched the idea in the grant that we wanted to run this pilot study under methodologically rigorous conditions. So we ran a randomized control trial. We blocked on classrooms. We were trying to best control for teacher effects. And we randomly assigned students within classrooms to either treatment, which was precision math, or control business as usual condition. So here are our procedures. We went and we recruited 10 1st grade classrooms. We used a universal screening process where we administered a set of whole number assessments. we really had limited access to measures around measurement and data analysis. So we felt like this was the best proxy for where students were currently performing. And then within each classroom, what we did was we rank ordered the students based on their performance, the whole number of assessments. And we took the 10 lowest performers. These were we consider at-risk learners. And we randomly assigned students within each classroom to either the precision math, treatment condition, or control, which was business as usual. So we had 49 students in treatment and 47 in control. Here's a quick view of our student demographics, and you can see the majority of the students were white, which is very representative of the state in the United States where we conducted the research. So treatment condition, we had 10 intervention groups, small group formats. They were taught by mostly folks who were employed in the district, but we also had to bring in some interventionists because resources are tight in schools. However, they had a collective battery of teaching experience behind them. And so, however, to improve fidelity and quality of instruction, we would argue a pretty comprehensive professional development package where they got curriculum workshops as well as in-class coaching. However, we found that we need to improve in the fidelity of implementation. We had some areas that were lower than expected, and we worked on those after following the pilot study. However, encouragingly, all students were able to receive the full dose of the curriculum, so they got all 32 lessons, which was great. The control condition was kind of a two-prong system. One, it consists of the core math instruction, so students continued to receive the math instruction delivered in their general education classroom. I should have said that also treatment students did as well. So precision math is more of a supplemental intervention. But for control students, about approximately half also received intervention supports above and beyond their core instruction. For our outcome measures, we had a host of different measures, and working from top to bottom, we went from more proximal measures that are more closely aligned to the objectives of the precision math intervention to more distal ones, like the easy CBM at the bottom, which is more of a global broad measure that's tapping into domains of geometry, measurement and data analysis, as well as whole number and operations. So we really wanted to cover the full gamut of mathematical achievement. Here are our results, and just to quickly orient you to the slide, these are effect sizes, Hedges G effect sizes. The column headers are the different outcome measures that we administered. And we contend at least that the results suggest a pattern of promise. Again, it's one study, right? But it's a pilot study, and we had positive effects on all measures. And so we recognize the promise as being based on the direction, I guess, if you will, the effect sizes versus the statistical significance. And so to conclude. Again, it's one study, but it was we had encouraging results in terms of demonstrating the promise of intervention. When we set out to conduct the study, we were definitely underpowered, and we were powered to detect medium effects. So there was encouraging results, at least being able to find out that we were moving some of the achievement dials on the different measures. However, when we started the project, we realized that there are very few outcome measures available in these mathematical domains. So we had to in order to be able to assess how students were doing, we had to develop a lot of those measures. And so that really makes us vulnerable to professional, scrutiny, I guess, if you will, from our peers. But we weren't sure what else to do if we're going to see whether students are making progress in these areas. One thing that really surfaced from this pilot study and this design work is that really the benefits of technology and how it can create this engaging context for students, and that teacher view, which really allowed the groups to kind of progress and stay on task throughout. So that was encouraging. And then finally, we were just recently funded this July for a well-powered randomized control trial through NSF. So we're kind of taking it to the next level, moving down the pipeline, the curriculum research framework to phase 10. And that's what Dr. Clarke, my colleague, is going to talk about here in a second. If there are questions, you can contact me. Here's my email address. If you have questions about precision math, I'm more than happy to answer them.
All right, I'm going to hop on here. It's over here. Okay. Oh, sorry, I didn't want to do that. Oh, that didn't work either. Is that still red for everybody?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think the presenter view doesn't work.
Yeah, I accidentally got on that. So let's do view, slideshow. And now swap displays. All right, how are we now?
Perfect.
All right, great, thank you. So like Chris said, I am going to start from the start. I'm going to be talking about some phase 10 work that we did with a first grade whole number intervention called Fusion. And like my colleagues, I'll give a shout out to our funding agency. We actually got funded for this efficacy trial about 4 years ago. So we're essentially wrapping it up and starting to really focus on dissemination efforts. But I'm going to go back and talk about the first 2 years of the efficacy trial and the results from the first sort of foray into examining this curriculum. I'll also note these tend to be pretty large scale projects. We end up working, with, close to 3,000 students and close to 120 classrooms. So you can imagine the amount of resources that are brought to bear, and these are some of the folks that help us with those objectives. This grant stemmed from an IES development grant, Institute of Education Sciences, who funds a lot of research in the United States and essentially a lot of curriculum development research in the United States. So in the development grant, we were really focused on initially the phases 1 through 3, thinking about our theory of change and how we wanted to operationalize that within a curriculum that was delivered to students that were at risk. And then we did, the first year that we had that development grant, we really focused on developing our learning models, developing our prototypes, doing some really small scale, very molecular testing of those prototypes before moving on into the evaluation category and phases essentially 5 through 9. Like Chris was talking, we ended up with a pilot study. That's the Clarke et al. 2014. We have an article by Chris that talks more about phases 7 and 8, feasibility and usability. And so eventually when we got to phase 9, the pilot and showing promise, we took that information back to our funders and said we have evidence of promise and we'd like to examine this in a full scale summative type of manner, which is phase 10. One thing that I would note is this is a huge issue for funding agencies in the United States where they fund a lot of development work, but very rarely are people getting to the next phase of looking at summative or phase 10 type of research. So people tend to get stuck a little bit in the development cycle and not make sort of that final leap. And I think in part, it might be because people aren't using these types of curriculum research frameworks that move things along as you go. And we've really tried to make that a point to essentially take everything that we get development dollars for and eventually get to that point where we're doing large scale efficacy trials. So again, this was really trying to say, does fusion work, with whom and under what conditions? So we had 2 primary aims for the research study. The first aim was relatively straightforward. We were going to test the efficacy of fusion intervention in 120 first grade classrooms, and we wanted to examine the immediate and long-term effects of the fusion curriculum. The second piece that we were interested in is by trade, I'm a school psychologist, and Chris is a special ed teacher, and other folks of our team are SPED or school psych folks. And so we have an interest in sort of linking our work and our research questions to resource allocation in schools. So if you're familiar with sort of response to intervention or multi-tier systems of support, one of the things that they're premised upon is this idea that as students' needs increase, you also increase the amount of resources that you provide them. So if you're providing a tier 2 intervention, it has a certain level of intensity. If you provide a tier 3 intervention, you provide more intensity. And typically the way that's done in the United States is through decreasing group size. So as your level of need increases, you decrease the group size, and that's supposed to drive more intensive instructional interactions between teachers and students by decreasing group size. So I'll talk a little bit about our theory and what would happen later on when we go to the results, but we're really interested in this because it has pretty significant implications for resource allocations in schools when you think about the delivery of small groups. So the Fusion curriculum, it's 60 lessons, it's 30 minutes per lesson. We study with either 2 or 5 students per group, and we implement it approximately over 12 weeks, typically when students come back from winter break. We were focused exclusively on whole number understanding. This aligns with the number of calls that you'll see in the research literature around the focus area. And we use the Common Core State Standards to define our content for the intervention. And we also made sure that we embedded not only sort of the content pieces, but also the practice pieces that are the mathematical practices that are specified in the Common Core State Standards. And largely, we had a pretty strong focus on number and operations in base 10, really getting students to think about place value. We know that that's a foundational skill as kids go into obviously first grade and then the grades following that. We tried to do that in a pretty robust fashion. We make sure to integrate lots of opportunities to engage in problem solving for students. One of the concerns with kids that are at risk is that they sort of only get interventions that are focused on procedural understanding. We wanted to make sure, one, we focus on concepts and then the application of those concepts to novel problems that the kids could engage in and solve mathematically. The other piece that we put a strong emphasis on was this idea around math vocabulary and discourse. Getting kids, again, the opportunity to engage in explaining their mathematical thinking, getting feedback on that thinking, to really sort of push their understanding of key concepts and being able to articulate their problem solving process and how they approach mathematics. Across all this, we used an explicit systematic instructional framework in the special education, the at-risk literature. If you look at any of the sort of current summaries, this is probably the #1 research finding that we have in terms of how best to teach students that are struggling. So we use an explicit systematic instructional framework across all the lessons. So this is essentially what a typical lesson would look like. You can see at the start, we always listed for the instructor, which was similar to Chris's study. We used instructional assistants that were already embedded in the schools. And we do this essentially because we want to make sure that we have as much link to how our interventions would actually be used in practice down the road. And the reality is in US schools is that in kindergarten and first grade, early elementary grades, it's typically going to be an instructional assistant. So that's who we wanted to use to increase sort of the viability of our findings. So we would always start with a warm-up activity. You can see the strand, and in this case it was place value, but we might have a couple different strands in there before ending with a warm-up activity. Not all the content that is taught in the lesson is new content. We would oftentimes have the new content be in activity 4 or 5 after priming some background knowledge in earlier activities. Lays out for the teacher the materials that are going to be used, the key vocabulary we highlight, and then we also have sort of these symbols that would help the instructor sort of navigate through the curriculum as they were engaging with the students. So for study design, we used a similar study design as what you just heard about, which was a randomized block design where we block on classrooms. And in this case, we identified the 10 lowest students and we randomly assigned them to one of 3 conditions: 2 treatment conditions, a fusion small group of 2, or a fusion small group of 5, or control. And the control students would be 3. So out of the 10 students, 2 would go to the small group, 5 would go to the large small group, and 3 would go to control. So the study was in Oregon across 53 classrooms. The eligibility criteria was a screening measure. They had to be below a certain threshold and be identified as strategic or intensive. Once we had the students randomly assigned, we ended up with these ends in our different conditions of 230 for the 5-to-1 student small group, 91 in the 2-to-1, and 138 for control. So again, interventionists were primary instructional assistants. This is, you can see the same model that we used in the Precision Math project, where we provided professional development to support the fidelity of implementation. And this is a list of our measurement net. It's a little bit more extensive than what you saw in the pilot study that Chris talked about, because we had more funding, and so we could collect a little bit more information. So we have up top, Aspen's profusion, easy CBM, and TEMA. So again, a range of measures from proximal to the intervention to distal. We were also interested in some underlying potential cognitive variables that might interact with the treatment. So we have things like head, toes, knees, and shoulders to look at executive functioning. We collect a lot of survey information from the teachers about the instruction that they're providing as part of the core. And then we went in and we did a pretty intensive observation system to see whether or not the curriculum was being taught as intended, and then also to look at those teacher-student interactions that we were particularly interested in. So again, our research questions align with the aims. What was the overall impact, and was there a difference between the 2-to-1 student group and the 5-to-1 student group? So for overall impact, you can see the results here. We had effect sizes essentially ranging from 0.02 to 0.77. Strongest effect was on the proximal measure. So 2 out of the 4 were significant and positive. The remaining 2 were positive but not significant. So again, we would say that this is relatively strong results when looking at impact. And then for impact by group size, this is comparing 2-to-1 to 5-to-1. We found that the 2-to-1 student groups had stronger outcomes, significant stronger outcomes on 2 out of the 4 measures on the TEMA, which is our most distal measure, which is interesting. And then also on the easy CBM measure, and positive but non-significant results on 2 of the other measures, the Aspen's and the profusion. So what was particularly interesting is that we had done a very similar study in kindergarten with an intervention called Roots, where we tested overall impact, and then we tested impact by group size, and we found no differences between group sizes in kindergarten. So we hypothesized that we would find the same in first grade. We actually found differences in group size in first grade. So it was sort of anti our hypothesis going in, which was interesting. We have different members of the team have different theories as to why that might be, but it was sort of an interesting finding that in kindergarten, we didn't find any differences with group size, and in first grade, we did. So again, this is the summary of the research questions that I just went over on the previous 2 slides. And there's contact information for us, and I'm going to turn it over to Lina so she can get her presentation in here.
What do I have here? Sorry, I'm getting it together here. Share this. All right. Can see everything all right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yep.
okay, great. So I want to be sure to leave room for questions. Sorry, let me fix this again. So I'm going to try to talk quickly so that we have some time at the end for people to ask. But my name is Lina Shanley. I work at the University of Oregon with Ben Clarke, and I want to talk a little bit about Project MAP, which Ben, as Ben mentioned in the beginning, is sort of a project where we're at the very tail end of this evaluation study and then looping back around to try to collect some information to inform our a priori work and then future development work. So Project MAP was funded by the National Science Foundation through a series of grants that are listed here. And again, Ben is the PI of that project, and then you can see the other co-investigators. And the aim of Project MAP was essentially to investigate domain general and domain specific correlates of math intervention response. So essentially what we've done is layered fMRI scanning on top of the intervention work that Ben talked about Project Fusion in the last presentation. And so what we're trying to do is gain some more information about the mechanisms that are at work in math intervention response and math development, so that we can better understand who the intervention is working for and why, and who it's not working for and why. So to try to get a little bit more basic science information about math intervention response. So like I said, this sort of fits into this curriculum research framework that we use, where we're conducting work in the evaluation phase, circling back to the early phases. And then the idea is that findings from this study would inform development of intervention adaptations or additional interventions that could make our interventions more maximally effective for all students. So the research questions are listed here. Essentially, what we're doing is collecting data on a cross section of our first grade, so 6 and 7-year-old participants, and those end up being assigned to groups, either typical achievers, so kids who were not at risk and didn't receive intervention, and then we have at-risk controls, so students who are at risk but assigned to the control condition. And then within our treatment condition, we end up with 2 groups of students who responded to the interventions and students who did not respond to the intervention. And we're trying to see how those groups differ on these measures that we're collecting, and then general information about behavioral and neural changes related to intervention receipt. So our sampling plan looks something like this. What's really sort of unique and I think cool about Project MAP is that we sort of layered this project on top of the randomized control trial that Ben talked about. So we recruited, in our first 2 years, we recruited students directly from that study. So we were really studying math development and intervention response in this very authentic school-based context. And since the Fusion study has ended, then we've transitioned to district implementation of the Fusion intervention, and we're continuing to recruit students that are receiving math instruction and intervention in a school-based context. So you can see sort of the plan across the years. And here are the measures that we've collected. So many of these overlap with the Fusion measures that Ben talked about before. And then we've added a few that are administered at scan time permitting, and then a couple other domain-specific measures that we also administer to kids who participate in this portion of the study. And so far we've collected 3 cohorts, and you can see the classrooms that they come from respectively. We unfortunately lost our 4th cohort this year. So, but on the previous cohorts, you can see the classrooms. And then I think it's sort of interesting to note that those classes have been taught by 25 different teachers in different configurations. And just for context, 4 of those teachers have participated across all 3 years of the study. And in total, we've worked with 121 students. You can see the demographic information there, which is very similar to what you've seen in the other studies. And all these students are local to our University of Oregon area so that we can get them in for scans. So that's what our population looks like. And we have about 50 typical achieving kids we've worked with, about 50 kids who've received the treatment. Those will eventually go on to be our responders and non-responders, and about 17 students who were control students. So, and another sort of interesting thing we've done is we've been able to collect some longitudinal follow-up data with these students. So we've collected data after 2nd grade and after 3rd grade as well. So quickly, some of the work that we're doing, because we haven't collected our full cohort of students, we haven't started to look really closely at those responders and non-responders, or really differences in categories of students, but just some general information about how our samples are responding. So we've looked at differences in approximate number system performance based on math skill, and then started to dive into some of our MRI data to look at differences in functional connectivity, which is our end goal. We've also done work just to identify resting state networks, which is very interesting and something sort of new to me. My background's in special education, so this is all new to me, and don't ask me any questions, but here it is. We've actually collaborated quite a bit with Eric Wilkie, whose face I saw on the call, and Daniel Ansari in some of this work. And I'll also give a shout out, there were a couple other faces I saw there, Nicole Heller and Taylor Lesner, I saw them up top. They've done some of our data collection and gotten us these pictures. So yeah, so this is some of the work that we're doing early on. And then we've done quite a bit of work sort of trying to deal with issues in scanning young children. So we're using this firm software and collaborating with Damien Fair to look to see how we can best use our data. We're trying to collect resting state data for our participants. And so we have a manuscript that we're working on to talk about some ways to sort of piece together data to get a good sample for our participants. And then, like I said, with Eric, we're working on looking at some of work in his real wheelhouse about non-symbolic number skill development. And since we have this sort of robust measurement net, we're able to look at a lot of interesting correlates to that for kids who've participated in our studies. So again, there's a manuscript pending there. And so then our future efforts then are just, we're trying to just complete our recruitment and our data collection, get our full sample, and then we'll be able to really dive into some of those questions that are really of interest to us about differences in intervention response and kids who respond and don't respond, and what we can learn. And then the idea is then to tie those findings back to improved screening and curriculum adaptations to improve intervention effectiveness, and sort of start all the way back again with our research framework. So that's Project MAP, quickly. So I think now we have 6 minutes for questions, if across any of the projects, or anyone there in the chat, or if people want to just speak up, or however you guys suggest we do it. Thank you again for participating.
Nice job, Lina.
Thank you all. Right. As Lina said, feel free to pop a question in the chat, or possibly just speak up. Let's see if we have plenty of questions at the same time. Actually, I have one, so I'm going to start. So this is really impressive work, and years and years of work, right? So that's really impressive. So I'm a dyscalculia therapist myself, so just for you to know as a background. And I'm wondering, because I'm seeing children on an individual basis, right? And I'm like having sort of math learning difficulties, or dyscalculia, whatever you want to call it. This group of children is super heterogeneous. And I was wondering, so how sort of the fairly scripted curriculum that you're developing might account for sort of individual differences in these children, because lessons sort of move onwards. And I was wondering how, individual children would sort of be taken care of. I'm aware that's sort of something in addition to what exists in the curriculum anyways, but so anything more would probably help. But how sort of can you account for these individual differences in children, and also how teachers react to this highly scripted kind of curriculum? That's something I'm just curious about. If you could comment on that.
Sure, I can do a couple things, and I'll have other panelists hop in as well. You know, from a broad perspective, like when we start talking about tiered service delivery in schools, they're done in small groups. So regardless of the content area, you're going to have differential response to whatever you do, and that's going to be true regardless of how you teach it, right? And so in research studies, we're trying to answer a really specific question about does the program work as intended? So we sort of keep in these initial research studies, we keep the program static, essentially. So we deliver it as intended. We deliver all the lessons, and then we look at outcomes. And then we try to, go back and look at who responded and who didn't respond. From a research design perspective, we're really moving towards the use of smart designs in the field, where you can essentially take those individuals that are showing a non-response pattern and think about differentiating the curriculum or putting them into a treatment that is based on their response level. So that might be, reteaching critical content. It might be, however you want to theorize about it. I know Chris is on a smart design study at UT Austin. You can hop in here. So that's sort of how we try to get at it within sort of the research framework. I think within the instructional framework, it's tricky. We do a lot with technology. And so like if we were working with, individual students, thinking about it from an individual student perspective, I could see a framework where everyone gets sort of a standardized protocol tier 2, and then they get some type of individualization as part of their tier 3. It could be delivered through technology or some other mechanism. So that's sort of more in practice and thinking about how these things will be implemented in practice.
And yeah, just to jump in quickly, and Julie, was your question about the scripting more reinterpreting it as at the student level, like the student would be reading the scripting, or maybe we didn't do a good enough? No, because
no, it was more about how the teachers basically how they like it, if they have a very clear script to kind of go through, or how flexible.
That's a good question. We've worked with teachers who are scripted programs, and at the end, when they see the achievement and gains of their students, they maybe turn around. But we also when we hand these programs to interventionists and teachers, we say, you can introduce your personality to it. You don't have to be this monotone person just doing a read aloud. But the thing is, we're able to, one, control the preciseness of the mathematical content, the vocabulary and such, but doing that, and also it removes the onus of having or forcing teachers to design their own programs and interventions and lessons. And teachers are so busy with so many other things that they do. So we contend that it's beneficial for the students, most importantly, but also it really helps out the teachers. But a lot of this can be very, very novel for folks who've never done that. But when trained well and with practice and time, it seems to be a pretty well-oiled machine and we've seen this across programs.
Thank you. I think Angela popped the question in the chat.
Yeah, Maria, I don't know if you want to address this. I don't know if Maria's either she's very stoic or she's frozen. Angie, I can address that. That's a really good question. Because in science education, there's this push for you jettison the word guided, and it's just inquiry instruction. And so we're probably pushing the envelope with that particular program with Sci2 in terms of incorporating principles of explicit systematic instruction. They're actually teaching students, to put it candidly. And where some science educators would say, no, you shouldn't do that. You should allow some type of inquiry in that aspect. That's a fine balance. And when we started designing the Sci2 intervention, we knew that we wanted to provide access to all students. And knowing that a lot of these classrooms have a considerable number of at-risk learners, leaning on the literature, we said we're going to embed explicit and systematic instructional within this intervention and kind of interweave those, but also allow for some type of inquiry learning. But it's a very I'd love to present the results. We're in the registered report process. Once that gets published, to see whether I would be kind of kicked out of a science educator conference or not by saying that. I'm not sure. But it's if you have insight or suggestions, I'm more than happy to take them. I don't know if that answered your question or I just dodged it. So.
No, you just sort of confirmed what I thought because I'm working on some of that in some mathematical modeling
Yeah.
um,
It can,
work, and it's difficult.
yeah, I think you can allow for creativity, inquiry, if you will, those opportunities. But there's also knowing that time is precious in schools. If these concepts and skills have to be taught, and we're expecting students to learn these, then my belief is fundamentally is that you have to teach them, right? So people see the world differently, though.
Thanks.
Just wanted to quickly say we're running a bit over, but I hope you're here for a couple more minutes. At least one question is left. I think Eric wanted to ask one.
Yeah, hey, thanks. Awesome scope of work. Thanks for presenting it all. I was curious, I wanted to follow up with the question you alluded to yourself, Ben, about the differences between the group effect sizes in the Roots curriculum and the Fusion curriculum. Do you said there are kind of different opinions on why there wasn't a group size effect in one and there was another, but just, yeah, curious about your thoughts.
Yeah, it was really fascinating. When we did the Roots project, which is a kindergarten math intervention, we had a theory that there would be differences between the group sizes, and we were wrong. So then we modified our theory for the first grade intervention that there wouldn't be group differences, and we were wrong. So we're 0 for 2 so far on our predictions. Yeah, to me, I think about it from a content perspective. I think that the content in first grade, at least as we've operationally defined it in the curriculums, is substantively more difficult. And I think that the students were going to, like, even in a 2 or 5 student group in kindergarten, the students were going to learn the content. The content was relatively easy. And so you got good effects for both sizes. But I feel like there's a pretty big jump up in terms of what we expect first graders to do. And hence what was taught in the curriculum was, more challenging and so forth. And so perhaps in the 2 student group, students would get, have more access to that more difficult content. So that's sort of what I'm thinking. Chris looks at it through a lens, I think, more of like instructional interactions and sort of group dynamics, and he can give his hypothesis.
Yeah, that was well summarized. Just anecdotally walking around, I mean, these are hundreds of classrooms walking around and just informally observing the different groups, at least in the kindergarten intervention, that, when you're sitting there with an interventionist or only 2 students, if I say, Eric, this is your question, then I'm going to go to the next student, it's Ben, and then I'm probably going to go back to Eric. Kids kind of know their routine, and I don't know if it just wasn't as dynamic, I felt like, where the groups of 5 to 1, it just seemed not that they're like, oh, I don't want to answer this question, but it seemed more engaging for them. Just, again, this is anecdotally, but also I think there's something going on. We didn't really capture it, and with peer-to-peer interaction, peer-to-peer learning, there's something there. I think in larger, like, manageable groups that we didn't unpack, and maybe for future studies we need to. But and maybe Ben mentioned this, it has finding that, at least in the kindergarten study, that 5 to 1 is equal to 2 to 1. It has resource implications, right? If you can intervene with more students at one time, it's going to save money. And but yeah, it's a very interesting question. And so IES must have liked it because they funded us for 2 studies.
Right. Any other questions?
Hello. Very interesting. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the presenters. It's a very interesting talk. My name is Maria Arcelidu. I would like to ask a question about your neuroimaging data. What were your hypotheses going in? And I guess you still have this in your preliminary data. What are they showing, and what are you specifically looking at to see the differences in the training or in the effects in executive function tests you're looking at?
Are you handing over to me, Ben?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the good question. Like I said, I'm not a neuroscientist by training, and so mostly we wanted to do some exploration, and because we were proposing to do sort of looking at functional connectivity and changes in connectivity, I've sort of learned as we've been conducting this study that it's sort of a wide open field. There's reasons that you could hypothesize that you'd expect to see increased connectivity in some areas, decreased connectivity in some areas relative to math response and learning. And so I think really are taking an exploratory approach. Our background, my background, is definitely more rooted in the academic assessments and a little bit more in, sort of numerical cognition. So we had some stronger hypotheses about those factors, about sort of what we'd see related to intervention response. But what's interesting is over time, we've investigated sort of the extent to which students' sort of cognitive profiles are related to intervention response. And we found that there aren't really differential response patterns based on cognitive skills. So the other sort of, I think, sort of exciting part of this project for us is that we're collecting those cognitive data longitudinally as well, so we can start to look at changes in cognitive skills for these young kids related to changes in math development. So we're really, sort of taking this exploratory approach to say, like, what sort of matches up, what can we see that is aligned, and then how can we use those information to then sort of test to see, do sort of more robust tests of whether or not building, sort of certain cognitive supports into interventions, or using screening data to assign students differentially, like via SMART trials like Ben's talking about, or other approaches. How can we sort of change who is likely to respond or not respond to the intervention? So I hope that answers your question.
I understand that you're looking at more exploratory in this, and I understand you said that you want to focus more on connectivity and how areas are connected, which are going to be expose these differences. But in terms of the networks, I'm kind of looking into which network are you looking at? You're looking at resting state data. Are you looking at, for example, the default mode? Why would you expect that to change, maybe with training, or the frontoparietal network? If you have any specific hypothesis. If not, that's okay. I understand this is a very interesting area of research, and that would be exciting to see the results in the future.
Yeah, my understanding from the work we've done thus far has really been, so Fred Saab is the neuroimager that we work with, and he runs our neuroimaging center. And so all that we've really done so far is just trying to see if we can identify networks even within our populations. And there's been quite a bit of discussion about how best to do that. So I'm sort of learning that, there are these different approaches to even, sifting through our data, right? And so all we've really done are mapping networks of for our populations, right, to see if there's even evidence of those. And we haven't really even looked closely at how they're related to the different math abilities. I think mostly because we're trying to wait till we have that full sample to see if we really find robust differences between the responders. But I did link to a couple of Flux presentations that we've made, and we have a couple of posters. I'm happy to share those. They probably have more specific information. And even Eric, who's on here, might know more specifics about what we've done. But yeah, I'm happy to try to find out the information for you.
Thank you so much, Lina. I would appreciate that.
Yeah.
I would just say, like, I think this is a very interesting project for us because, like Lina noted, none of us are neuroscientists. We all nest our work in schools. We all have sort of school backgrounds as either teachers or school psychs. And so, when we proposed this, it was really interesting because we had to sort of look outside of our immediate group of researchers to find people that were sort of interested in this partnership, and really make that connection between the two fields. And I know that that's been a huge push for, you know, the math cognition field, is to sort of work more closely with folks that are in schools. And so we are not only sort of doing it from like a science perspective, but I also think it's also sort of a trial of, you know, how can we leverage sort of expertise across these two different fields of study to sort of improve outcomes for kids, which is, I think, what we're all interested in.
I work from the opposite side. I'm always trying to find educators who want to work with people to do neuroimaging studies. So this is really cool. I'm really glad to see this kind of work being done. Thank you.
Right. Some more questions. Doesn't look like it. Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Great, thanks.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Appreciate it. And Andy.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you so much for a great presentation.
Yeah, stay
Bye,
safe.
thank you. Bye.